staring straight at us. There was a pair of green eyes. We followed it with a lamp. We saw it all the way across the field, came to the wall, 6 to 7 foot tall. They cleared the wall completely down the other side and was gone. I could identify it as a cougar.
I think they're firmly established in the food chain. They're obviously breeding. I was 12 when I first saw the black panther. Those cats are still reported in the same area now. They're here to stay.
Welcome to Big Cat Conversations. We speak directly to people who've encountered one of Britain's big cats. We also discuss the bigger picture. I'm Rick Minter, and thanks for joining me. Hi, and welcome to episode 122 of Big Cat Conversations. We're releasing this one in early March 2025. Later on, we will be catching up with Mark Graves. He's a good friend of the show and regular guest, and we even described him as our secret weapon on a recent episode. Mark will be briefly reflecting on a couple of incidents in recent editions, including the clawed Carcass in Herefordshire, and a couple of incidents that occurred in Cumbria when Liz described the mother and cub events. But first of all, I'm pleased to say we are back in Australia. As many of us will know, there's much interest in this topic from Australia. They seem to have their own similar big cats at large there, and it's good to have an excuse for a deep dive into a local case study which is coming up. Australia also has its own high-quality podcast on big cat encounters, and that's called Missing Panther. It's not active at the moment, but we do hope it returns at some time. Here on Big Cat Conversations, we last covered the Australian situation way back in episode 10, and that was with Simon Townsend, who has great experience on the subject, and he's also based in Victoria, which we're going to touch on now. So for this segment, we are going to hear direct from Andrea, a witness about her sightings, as well as kangaroo and wallaby carcasses she sees locally. Andrea has a few acres of land in an area called the Victorian Central Highlands Goldfields area, and that's about an hour and a half north of Melbourne, so to get your general bearings, that's just a bit inland in the southeast of Australia. So Andrea, good morning from Britain, and it's evening with you. Thanks so much for coming on the show.
Yeah, hi Rick. Lovely to be here.
Great, and thanks for getting in touch. Good listenership in Australia. We have, I get a lot of emails and contacts and feedback from Australia. Lovely to feel that there's people there listening. And of course in New Zealand has its own panther encounters as well. So hello to New Zealand listeners as well. So Andrea, first of all, could you tell us about the area you live, sort of scarred with gold mining areas? And I think we're also going to go straight into words of the week with you as well in describing your local area.
Yeah, well, we're on 17 acres here. Basically, the area is a combination of forested, or as we call it here, bush, and farmland. It's rural, quiet, there's low population. We actually have mountains east, west, and south of us. Australia only does low mountains, but, still it's areas of altitude and forested and wild. So really ideal habitat for big cats and definitely lots of wildlife.
Tell us about your term for Words of the Week, because I think that also relates to the landscape as well, doesn't it?
Yes, it does. It historically was a gold mined area, not right immediately where we live. This area wasn't mined, but a lot of the surrounding area was. And the Indigenous people of this particular area are the Jarrah people, and they have coined a phrase which is upside down country. And that basically is a descriptive term that refers to the environmental degradation, basically, that's taken place in this area since the 1850s mining from the gold rush. Obviously, a lot of the area was dug over, lots of mine shafts and tunnels and all manner of messing up the environment, really. And a lot of that still remains. So we have to actually be quite careful when we walk in some of the bushland areas. You don't want to end up down a disused mine shaft. Thinking about that term, I thought that globally that the big cats are really quite adaptable. They tend to be able to often make use of areas where man has impacted the landscape, whether that be for, if it's become wasteland or old mine shafts and so on, to be able to use them for den sites and layups. Like with quarries, I've heard that they're often found around quarries and so on. So, yeah, I just thought that was perhaps relevant.
Upside down country is a wonderful way of relating to the upheaval you get from scarred extraction of mining, open cast mining especially. Even on the last episode of Big Cat Conversations, we had Liz in Cumbria talking about this scrubbed over quarry area on the farm where she is. And you know, that's like a lost world to go in. She thinks that's one of the main refuges for the mother and cub. So it works everywhere, I think. And of course, your gold mining scarred area is scrubbed over. So it's quite wild and shaggy and thorny, presumably, which is how cats like it and how lots of wildlife likes it, of course.
Yeah, and I think some of those areas have been retained as sort of historic goldfields, kind of bushland areas, a combination of sort of wasteland and bushland.
Okay. Can we find out about your big cat journey then? What started you off on awareness of big cats locally? And before that, would you have had a view on potential big cats living in the wild in Australia?
I remember becoming aware when I was in my 20s. I'd moved to an area out of Melbourne called the Dandenong Ranges, and that is still an area of sightings. And I started to see occasional newspaper articles in the local newspaper. And yeah, it sparked my interest. I've always been a big animal lover. So as soon as I was aware that something as amazing as having a displaced big cats in our country, it just, really caught my attention. Around that time, I actually met a lovely, very straight up, honest couple that lived down the Yarra Ranges. He told me how he had seen what he believed to be a melanistic leopard cross his back paddock effectively. And he said it actually left some black fur in the barbed wire fence. So, this was a long time ago and I don't know what happened to that fur.
That's frustrating that it wasn't used for a DNA test.
I know, that's right. But then also my husband, John, he has actually had a sighting himself, and it was when he was about maybe 13, 14 and he was on a scout camp. And that was also in bushland out the back of the Dandenong Ranges, and him and some scout buddies were sort of sent off to set up their tent and basically startled two big black cats, which they just basically saw disappearing off into the bracken with their backs up above the line of the bracken, and being crazy boys, they chased them. I'm sure the cats got away pretty quick smart, but yeah.
Does he reckon they were the size of black leopards? Does he think that they were legit black leopards, or is he not sure?
Yeah, for sure. That's an area called Gembrook, and there are still current sightings to this day in that area. If I'm right, Victoria in area size equates to about Great Britain, but obviously with a much lower population. And we really do have quite a diverse range of landscapes. There's definitely key areas, the Grampians and the Otways and the Dandenongs, as I said, up here in the Goldfields area. Gippsland is another big one.
Any cats living in a lot of those places, they would hardly ever be seen during their lives, I would imagine.
Yes, I think it's very possible, given that they're already very discreet, creatures. I think it's very possible for them just to do their thing.
Yeah. And of course, I would urge listeners who haven't heard episode 10 to go back to that and hear Simon Townsend talk about, all aspects of the big cat phenomenon in Australia, but particularly the various types of origins, because some of them are assumed to be guarding animals or trophy animals and show-off animals that were bought by a lot of the prospectors. I mean, there's many different parts of gold mining areas across Australia, and you're in one of them. But so the different origins, military mascots and trophy pets, as in other countries, and Britain especially, they seem to be wild and fit and healthy, just like ours are in Britain. We'll come on to that later, the comparison with Britain.
Yeah, I have a little bit of input with the sort of origin stories. My mother is 91 and she remembers, she's old enough that she remembers the releases of mascots, that was a thing that was known. But also when I was living in the Dandenong Ranges, there was a private zoo up there that I visited. It would have been probably 1990, and it was pretty awful, really. And they did have big cats, and I remember being horrified by the smell of them. I heard many years later that it had closed down at some point, and the rumour was that some animals were released.
I mean, sometimes these people can't afford vets bills for euthanasia and health checks and that sort of thing. We'll never know all of the origins, but I think, they seem to be here now. And anyway, can you tell us about what you sensed, first of all, locally?
I think I just had this real awareness. It's basically been 2 years since we moved. When we first moved, I was just very struck by the fact that we're in the wildest place I've ever lived in. Everywhere else has been suburbia. I started hearing night noises and just wondering what they all were, and just basically started thinking, goodness me, I don't know what could be out here, and because I had this sort of historic interest, in big cats and so on, I basically just Googled and looked up and thought, well, have there been any sightings? So that was sort of the start of just checking out on Facebook groups and so on.
The skeptic would say, oh, well, you're biased and you're wishing for an event that confirms your interest. You'll have to deal with that as we go along.
Yeah. I mean, I've had the interest ever since I've heard about it, and it hasn't managed to conjure up anything before now,
Anyway, we can go through the sequence of events that brought you to realise there's things going on your land and, in the neighbourhood.
Yes. Well, after just basically checking things out on Facebook and through that finding your podcast, absolutely not expecting to ever see anything. One day there was a small dead kangaroo on the middle of the road, and I basically just stopped and moved off the road because I don't like wildlife getting hit, birds and so on that might come and feed on it. And I just went to move this animal and then was just struck by the fact that it was surgically opened up, all of its chest and abdominal cavity entirely cleaned out. And I just was sort of in shock, but also knew from what I'd heard that was suspicious, So that was the start. And that would have been July 2023. And then in August, I came across 2 more suspicious carcasses of kangaroos. One was a very large kangaroo off on one of the mountainous sort of roads. I said to my husband as we drove past, that was a nape wound, because I'd just been learning about them. That basically looked like it had just had something take an enormous chunk out of the back of its neck and shoulder blade, and I just got out, took a couple of photos and that was it. But, this was all sort of very new for me, but I was just responding to that looks unusual, Then it was really my first sighting. It was actually the 1st of September 2023. I was driving into town. I was doing a permaculture course at the time, and it was 9 o'clock in the morning on my way to my class, and it had been a very cold, frosty night, but it was a very bright, clear morning. And I'm driving around a bend, and it's a straight stretch on a forested road with another bend up ahead, and an animal came out from the right-hand side across the road and into the bush on the left-hand side. So it was a very quick sighting of this animal crossing the road. But where it crossed the road was in full sun. So I actually got a really good look at it. It wasn't sort of in filtered light or anything. It was large. It was reddish tan colour. My mind was going into sort of overdrive. Your brain speeds up and slows down at the same time and process everything. It definitely wasn't a dog, and it didn't have a muzzle of a dog. It had a short face and a relatively small head. It had thick legs, so it wasn't a fox. It was much bigger than a fox. It didn't have a fox tail. The tail was being carried sort of low. Didn't get really good look at that. It was cantering, so its stride was, that canter action, and I just started counting, and it basically only took 3 to 4 strides for it to get out of my sight. So very big, powerful animal with very long stride. The main feature that really stood out for me was the very big hindquarters. at that distance, that was just really very evident. This huge, strong hind leg and the very thick, I think, winter coat. With the sun on it, I could see darker areas of fur kind of through the reddish-brown fur. And, yeah, it came and it went really quickly and that was it. But it was like I knew what it wasn't and I pretty much knew what it was, but it's like your brain can't quite accept it. And I think in reality, I have to blame you slightly for that, Rick, because with listening to the podcast, I think I was kind of more prepped to, if I was ever to see anything, which I certainly didn't expect to, I think I expected to see a black one, just by the fact that they're more common.
Including in Australia?
Yes, that's right. And the other thing is, usually when you refer to the pumas, you say the sandy brown ones. And so in my mind, that was like a pale fawn colour. And so I actually didn't realise how much variance the pumas can have in coloration, and certainly didn't realise that they could be this quite sort of dark reddish tan. But when I got to where I was going, I didn't tell anybody, but I did a little bit of quiet Googling on the side and found an image, and it was like, yes, that's it. That was the colour. That's the big hind legs. That's the thick legs. That was it.
Those hind quarters, that's very characteristic of mountain lions, pumas, cougars. They have really strong springing, leaping ability, which those longer legs give them. Witnesses often say higher at the back end for a mountain lion in particular.
Yeah.
Colour tones, very interesting. I remember a case in Gloucestershire. We had two women about 5 years ago, both seeing a mountain lion in the same couple of weeks, and they sort of swapped notes on a local Facebook group. They both looked at images of mountain lions, and they both said it was the darker, more gingery tone of the brown range that they have. And so they both agreed, more the chestnutty sort of tone. If your one was seen in the bush rather than against a road, it probably would have been more cryptic and more difficult to see, do you think?
I sort of tend to feel in bright morning light, if it was black, you would have just really got that outline. Because I remember thinking the tail's not out the back, because I have seen videos of when they're running kind of full tilt and they're sort of using their tail like a balance and it's straight out, And the tail wasn't like that, but it was just cantering. It wasn't panicked. It was just kind of loping, in a relaxed way across the road. So I think the tail was carried down. So, yeah, I wonder whether I would have just seen it in more clarity, but it depends, because if it was obviously in shadow, then maybe you'd see it even less. So who knows?
Okay. What kind of emotions and feelings did you have at the time and in the following sort of days from that?
I have a whole lot of stuff, really, sort of shock, because it, really wasn't expected. I had never really even much noticed to the pumas, I'd sort of definitely never thought that I would see one of those. Yeah, just amazement, really, excitement, but it's kind of a bit like, what do you do with this information too, I think if I had been on holidays and I had seen it quite some distance elsewhere, away from my home, then that would be different as well. But when it's like, okay, so that's like, because this was where I actually saw it was really only a couple of kilometres out of town. It's very forested and just wild for miles, but, still close to town.
Makes a realisation that there's one on your doorstep. And who did you decide to share that information with?
With my husband and sort of, in bits and pieces with different people. I certainly didn't share it on that day with anyone in my class. I just wanted to sit on it and think about it, really.
Did talking about it with some other people selectively bring out more reports?
Yeah, down the track. I did end up sharing with some of the people from my permaculture course, down the track. And then one of the guys who had lived in this area, was born in this area, he said this was about 20 years ago, he was in a paddock with his black kelpie And he just kind of glanced across the paddock and he thought, oh, there's my dog. And then he kind of did a double take and realised, no, it's not, and my dog's right at my leg. And he said that that was a cat the size of his Kelpie dog. So he believed that he'd seen a melanistic leopard. But, yeah, since my first sighting, one of the girls that come and does some work on my property with me, it ended up coming out in conversation one day that we both had a bit of an interest in this topic. And she said, I think I've seen one. And I said, I think I've seen one, and we shared our stories. And hers was roadside. She was driving also, and she saw the hind quarters, so big hind quarters and tail going into high crop. So she only saw the black end. But interestingly, it was a puma. Well, she believed it was a puma, and it was the same coloration as what I had seen. So that was my sighting, was start of September, and hers was then that summer.
Hers was locally, was it as well?
20 to 30 kilometres away, maybe.
Did that event then get you even more primed locally to sort of listen out and look for carcasses? How did it affect you in the following weeks and months?
Yeah, it just got me sort of super interested. But, you don't ever think that you're going to see another one or anything. And I'd only had the 3 suspicious carcasses to that point. I think nothing else sort of really further happened. So it was not something that just happened that I just kind of put aside in my brain. It definitely was quite a key event and really triggered a deep interest and quite a deep interest just in pumas. I've tried to learn, as much as I can about the animals.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because one distinct call in their range that pumas have is this chirping. It's slightly avian-like, slightly bird-like, but it is quite distinct, and it is the way they communicate to each other. Did you learn about the fact that they do that before you heard chirping on your land?
Yes, I had heard about it on the podcast. That was actually about 12 months ago to now. It was mid-February last year. I was outside where I am now with my animals. Well, we were watching television, actually. We've got sort of like an outside lounge out here. I heard a noise above the noise of the television that triggered the interest of one of my animals, and he went out to investigate, and I quietly went out. It was like a bird, but certainly not any bird I'd ever heard. And I just started to think, oh my goodness, could that possibly be that chirping thing? So I actually quietly just sort of Googled it and listened to it on my phone. And I was hearing the sound from the bush. I was hearing it quite clearly. It's quite a clear sound. And the other thing that was happening at the same time is the neighbours' dogs were going berserk. They're a little way away, but I could hear them barking. And I could hear this call that was quite clear and penetrating. And it really did sound like it was actually on our land. It was down towards our large dam. But it definitely didn't sound like it was out beyond our fence lines. I Googled it and quietly played this video, and then I'm hearing it sort of in stereo, like I'm hearing it on my phone and I'm hearing it out through the fence. So it was pretty full-on experience. And I came into my husband, but he's got a bit of hearing impairment. And so I told him what was going on, and he came out. He actually did hear it as well, but then he spoke to me, and because we were then talking, it stopped. Very hard for me to categorically say what that was, but it definitely, I've listened to the audio of that puma chirping since, and, definitely that it's the best approximation of what I heard that night. And I haven't heard it since. So you would think if it was a bird that was a night bird, one, I'd be aware of it, and I feel like I am quite aware. of our local night birds or if there's something that's coming in seasonally. But if it was anything that was the normal run-of-the-mill creature that was you would expect here, then you'd think I'd hear it again.
You mentioned the animal with you. You look after 2 dingoes, I think. How did they react to that noise?
Yeah, so we're privileged to be the guardians of 2 pure dingoes, and they're Dargo and Pindara. Dargo is my male, and he's the alpha of the pair. And he is the one, he was sort of more onto things like this, like he'll be the one that will be being more protective. So Pindara slept through and Dargo actually heard it and he went out, and I noticed the sound and noticed he had gone out. So I don't know what he made of it. He didn't seem to be responding in fear in that instance, but he was certainly responding with interest.
How long was that whole incident?
Just a couple of minutes, really, like from hearing it to going out to hearing it a few times. Like it was kind of calling. It wasn't like I had to wait for the next one. It was, several vocalizations. And then I got John to come and have a listen. So, yeah, probably only really a couple of minutes.
Do you think it was from one animal? Because obviously the chirping is local communication between them. So for one to do it, what did you make of that?
I think it was only from the one animal, from what I could discern. It only seemed to be coming from one direction. I think I would have been able to tell if there was like an answering call. Yeah, so I believe it was just from the one.
Yeah, okay. Maybe this is a good time to tell us about dingoes then, and how you came to look after 2, and a bit about the issue in Australia about giving dingoes more respect.
They're incredibly special animals. They are apex predators. They're very intelligent. You do have to have a license, a special dingo license to have them in Victoria. The different states have different regulations. It's just an amazing privilege, really, to live with these animals. We learn so much from them. Both of ours were sanctuary born, but my little girl, her father was a wild-born rescue that was found starving. There are definitely pure dingoes in the wild in Australia, which for a long time we were led to believe that there weren't. They are threatened. They are not properly protected in Australia. They are considered native, but then if they're near private land or on private land, they're not protected. And, yeah, unfortunately, not unlike wolves, they're very misunderstood, get a bad rap, although the general public these days are a lot more positive towards them, but they often don't really understand all the issues, They definitely need better protections. Really, our environment would be better off if they were able to be in the wild in more places. And just with the big cats, even though they're not really meant to be here, they're acting as effective apex predators in the landscape, which is helping to manage the herbivore numbers. So it's very important just to kind of keep it all in balance. One of the reasons why this is a real interest for me, because I actually live with predators and they should be in the wild, but they're not. So then to have these other ones that are kind of doing their wild thing covertly, it's quite an interesting situation.
Full of ironies and paradoxes.
Absolutely.
Just quickly on a bit of the background to dingoes, they're pack dogs to some degree, aren't they?
They're not really considered pack dogs in the same way that wolves are. They're actually more family dogs. The male and female will be a bonded pair and they will mate for life unless they lose their partner, and sometimes they'll even die from grieving if they lose their partner. So they're very bonded. If you see more than 2 dingoes, it's usually the parents with the young, and sometimes the young get up to speed and up to size quite quickly, as predators have to. So people can think that they're all adults, but they might be juveniles. In some areas, they may cooperatively hunt if they need to band together with other families. That's going to be the best situation for them, with their hunting, depending on prey availability and types of prey and size of prey and so on. Often you might see one, but its partner will be somewhere, or you might see 2 together. I mean, if you're very, very lucky to see them at all, really. I have been lucky enough to see some dingoes in the wild in South Australia and Western Australia.
What were they predating? They wouldn't pick off wallabies and kangaroos, would they?
Yeah, they can bring down. They're very strong. Like, they're not big. They're obviously a lot smaller than wolves. Dargo at full size is just under 20 kilograms and Pindara is just under 15. But they can take down a kangaroo, maybe not on their own, or obviously it depends if it's injured or if it's young. They're omnivores for starters, so they're not just strict carnivores. So they're very opportunistic eaters. They will eat eggs and fruit and all sorts of things as well as meat, and they will feed on roadkill and so on. They actually are more ambush because they don't really have the stamina to just run something down and like some animals do. Like our guys have their burst of activity and race around like crazy loons. They can run up to 60 kilometres an hour, but then after a few minutes they're done, back to sleeping. Research shows they don't actually kill many sheep. They don't actually like to even eat sheep. They actually can't metabolize fat or grain. So there's things they can't eat and won't eat. Mutton is actually too fatty for them. So they much prefer to have native kangaroos and wallabies or rabbits and lean meat.
A bit like the cats as well. I think that goes for the cats.
Yeah, I think so too. Yeah. There's also farmers in Australia who are now choosing to not persecute dingoes on their land, like big land, huge big properties in Western Australia or in Northern Territory that used to be obligated basically to kill dingoes by the government, and they're saying, no, we're not going to. And so they end up with their own population of dingoes on the land that they let do their thing, and the dingoes actually help bring back the whole system, like the whole environment recovers because it's got the apex predator managing it again. So there's some beautiful stories out there of what is happening in some places, but unfortunately we've still got a long way to go, sort of like turning the slow ship.
Sure, yeah. Well, that's nice. That is good. I think things like that do change slowly. And I think also farmers are the best people to influence other farmers and landowners and estate owners, that they're going to influence each other far more than anybody thumping the table about it will.
Absolutely. And especially when they can see the financial benefit to them, because they're not putting money into chemicals and shooting and so on, and they end up with more grass because the herbivores are managed and, it's a win.
Very nice. And just quickly, some of the sort of snippets about looking after dingoes yourself on your own property, and you have them in a separate little enclosure by the back porch, do you?
They have a very large enclosure not too far from the house. It has 3-metre high fencing and skirts so they can't dig out, but they don't want to. This is their home. They love it here. So they have a big enclosure, and that includes an inside section of a shed and then an adjoining section, which I'm actually out with them at the moment. So I'm on a couch in a sort of a dingo lounge, basically, so they have access to this area under supervision with us. So, yeah, they're very spoilt. We spend a lot of time with them. Definitely would not want to say dingoes are great, go out and get a dingo, because they're a massive responsibility, and we take that responsibility very seriously, and they're a very integral part of our life and our lifestyle, and their needs are a top priority for us.
What about purity? How many others are around that are not fully pure?
Well, our guys are pure. Recent studies by Kylie Can, who's doing a lot of DNA research, PhD doctor in genetics, specifically in dingoes. She has shown that the majority of dingoes in the wild are either pure or extremely high content dingoes. There's a lot more purity out there than what we were sort of led to believe. Unfortunately, they've been kind of called wild dogs instead of dingoes, which kind of then people think, oh, well, they're just wild dogs, we can dispose of them, So we're really needing to realise, no, they're actually a really unique species. other researchers showed that they don't actually come from a wolf or dog lineage. We already knew they were a separate species, but they're of actually separate genetic lineage. So they're incredibly unique and special.
We'll put a reference in the references and links part of this episode on the website, on the Big Cat Conversations website, to some dingo background material references, if you can provide us with that, because I think it is important. It's a learning opportunity to understand another apex predator and a large animal impacting the ecosystem, and learning to live with it is important. And as we go through further incidents, any other snippets of how you notice the dingo's awareness to potential big cats around would be good. So may as well move on to the next sort of incident that you thought was big cat related then.
So there was an incident last March where I was woken at 4 o'clock in the morning by Dargo doing this sort of rapid fire barking, which is actually really unusual for a dingo. But he will sometimes bark, and I can tell his different types of barks that give me different information about what's going on. Today he barked a couple of times and I thought, so Dargo's upset about something and there was dogs on the land, you know. But this night, this was absolute panic. Like he was, if he kept going, he was just going to scream. And I ran outside. The lights flashed on along the veranda, automatic lights, and I just raced down to the enclosure without worrying about my own safety and went into them, and they were both standing really rigid with their tails in really unusual positions that I'd never seen before, looking out into the dark, very panicked, very heightened. And I hopped up on their sort of tower thing that we built for them, and Dargo's heart was literally pounding. I had no idea what it was, obviously, but it really makes me think, like, what on earth freaked out my apex predator to that degree? Because we see how he behaves with foxes, cats, dogs, rabbits, deer, goats, like all sorts of animals, and nothing has caused him to behave like that. So I really wondered, was there potentially a bigger predator that came onto our land in the dark that night? You know, I don't know.
And if there had been trespasses, they would presumably have, it's rare for you to have trespasses closer to the house.
Oh, he wouldn't have responded with that panic if it was a person. It would have been a warning kind of bark to tell me that there was somebody there, but not sheer panic.
Yes, got you.
Chronologically, really what happened next was last April. It was a beautiful sunny Sunday and I had a friend staying, and John and I did a loop walk from our property with the two dingoes through the small wildlife reserve nearby, and we can kind of come back through our back fence. We've done this walk lots of times and we often see kangaroos or whatever, wallaby, but we're just kind of coming back along a fence line towards home, maybe 200 metres from home, and then John alerted me to the fact that there was animal guts on the ground. So we don't want to stand on that. We don't want the dingoes getting into it. And so we avoided that. And then he said, oh, there's the rest of it. And about 10 metres away, there was what remained of a small to medium-sized kangaroo, and all that was left of it was one hind leg and the tail still attached to each other, everything else gone, and just bright red blood, like just so fresh. I'm sure if we had have touched it, it would have been warm. And our first response was just to keep the dingoes away from it. We basically just walked home, put the dingoes away, gave them their breakfast, actually went and talked to our house guest, had our breakfast, and returned an hour later thinking we'll set up a trail camera and take some photos. Well, we knew exactly where this had been, followed the fence line down, saw the guts, which had actually now turned brown in the sun, which showed how glisteningly fresh they had been an hour prior. The carcass remains was gone and there was no drag marks. That was pretty real. That one impacted my husband, you know, because he had not been present for some of the other carcass viewings and so on. That was like, wow, we potentially disturbed that animal. It's moved away and then it's come back while we were not here.
Did the dingoes react in any way to a smell of or a sense? Did they sense a potential predator around or not?
They didn't seem to react, but apparently I've read that pumas don't have much scent. Like leopards do, but the pumas don't. I mean, the dingoes wanted to get to the fresh meat, but they weren't really picking up another predator at that point. That ended up becoming the start of a really gory spate of carcasses. I was finding carcasses every few days and in close proximity to our property. It was quite full on, really, and I was amazed by how much meat was being consumed. When I would find a carcass, I'd photograph it and take note of it. Where I could, I'd go back each day and photograph it and observe it. Things were being eaten down in big cat manner, with a variety of kill techniques. I think some of them had been hit by cars and then consumed, but other ones seemed to actually be taken down by just observing the carcasses, like with big head injuries or nape wounds, or, just you could see raking and scratching on the animal, but then the actual consumption manner and rate was all kind of fairly consistent, and often they'd get eaten out over 3 or 4 nights.
Always large kangaroos, were they?
No, there was a period where there was several that seemed to be mothers with young, and they were eating the babies as well, the young in the pouches. That was pretty awful. There was, a real inclination for females with young, seemed. I mean, obviously my sample is limited, but just from my experience. But another thing I noticed that I have seen several large males that I really believe have been taken out from behind an ambush attack with a big head nape. Some of them have been entirely scalped or half scalped, or big back of neck wounds. And sometimes those big males, they don't get eaten and nothing else touches them. I can go and check them day after day, and the only thing that's going on them is flies and wasps and ants. So those ones I find quite interesting, because the big male kangaroos will protect the mob, and they will often wait. Like, we'll even have it on our land. They let the females move away and they'll wait and sort of protect their mob. So I don't know. I mean, so much of this is just, guesswork, but it makes me wonder, are they taking out the big males so that they can get to the mob, or do they not eat those ones because they're too tough, or who knows?
And in terms of predating kangaroos, now, I'm assuming that although kangaroos are in different places at different times, there are locations where they do congregate. They're consistent locations where a predator cat would think, they congregate here quite often, I'm going to lie in ambush here. Is that how the strategy might work?
Yes, well, we can have regular kangaroos that we'll see on our land. And then sometimes when I think there's been cat activity, we don't see the kangaroos for a time, which is interesting. Because we're walking with our dingoes in the bush every day, we get to observe all the wildlife quite closely, and you see the animal trails, you see the points. They can be quite habitual with where they'll jump over fences and follow certain trails. I think down the wildlife reserve where we found that one that was really munched up and then it disappeared, that was on a trail. That was where roos would come over that fence.
That's the place to put your trail cameras, of course, those key funnel points.
I know. We've got to get them down there. Another interesting one down there is that sometimes poor kangaroos get their legs caught in the fence, and it had got his leg entangled in the top wires, and all that was remaining was the foot still stuck in the fence with the attached leg, but it was still red, but like still fresh, And the area around it was very worked over, where an animal had basically eaten away the whole animal except for that leg. And we came across this with the dingoes. What I really observed, which was fascinating, was that there's a fresh kangaroo leg in the fence. They showed no interest whatsoever in that fresh meat. They sniffed and sniffed and sniffed around on the ground with their hackles up. They don't do that if they sense fox. So they were focused only on the smell of what had happened down there with that animal getting eaten. So I found that interesting.
Good stuff. Okay, so do we now go on to your next sighting?
Yeah, so poor Rick had to put up with me sending you lots of emails of gory images of carcasses that went for quite some time. And then it was October of last year, so 2024. It was the 24th of October because it was the day before my mother's birthday. And we did that loop walk around through the wildlife reserve that I've mentioned, where some of that action has been, with the disappearing carcass and the roo's leg caught in the fence and so on. It was an unseasonably cold, windy morning, and it was about 8:30 in the morning. And we're just doing a standard walk with the dingoes, and we're just coming along, and then Dargo starts to pay attention ahead, and I'm just fully expecting kangaroo is just going to come out from behind a bush or something. So I'm watching Dargo, and kind of because we've got to watch the snakes in this season as well. So you're watching where you're walking, you're watching sort of middle distance, just kind of scanning everywhere. So I'm kind of looking ahead, and I see some movement behind some bushes, and it's just wrong. Like, it's not an upright look of a macropod like a kangaroo or a wallaby, where they're very kind of upright in their stance. And this is something else. It's something low, something kind of horizontal. And then all of a sudden out it comes. And it's a tan animal running on 4 legs. And it's a puma. It's a very quick sighting again. It's running behind small trees and bushes. I only got just a broken view of it behind vegetation at about 100 metres. But once again, it's a cat motion. It's fast, it's silent. It was gone really quickly, but this was actually a different colour. It was more the lighter tan colour. But the thing I noticed was, you know how some pumas have white, either kind of on the back of their hind legs or sort of the inside of their hind legs?
Yeah.
I saw that coloration, so it's like tan with white on the hind legs. Like, that was kind of all the information I could kind of take in. Small head, very long body. This one was maybe smaller, but it's hard to tell because, this one was from ground level and it closer, but, it's hard to really tell. But it was a different animal, but I believe it was a puma. And I said to my husband that was a puma, and he wanted to go after it. And I'm like, no way.
He got the same view pretty much, did he?
No, he didn't, because he was watching Dargo. So he didn't see it. He was looking down watching Dargo, and I saw it. And, oh, my goodness, I so wish he'd seen it too. But no. So because he hadn't seen it, he wants to kind of follow it. And I was like, no way, I saw it. I don't want to follow it on foot. Thank you very much. But we kept going, and then Dargo started to pull. And he actually picked up, I think it was a rabbit front leg, and ate it. So I think that the animal had got a rabbit and was down concentrating on having that. Also, I think that there was a crosswind. So I think that's why we got that distance to it before it realised we were there. So I think it was crouched down eating, and the wind was going across between us and the animal.
It definitely scurried away because you disturbed it, you think?
Oh, absolutely. I think it went probably from, when I saw movement, I think it was probably going from crouched down eating position to sort of stand up position. And then it realised it had to get out of there and shot out. It wasn't running full tilt in blind panic. It was, just measured. But, yeah, it was very quick again and gone, and sort of running kind of up a hill a little bit, so it was sort of quickly out of our sight. But interestingly, kangaroos then shot down, like from the direction that it had hopping at speed. It's like they had been startled by the animal and had come down across the back of us to get away.
In those kinds of situations and any other situations, have you ever heard what might be alarm calls from birds?
On that day, I wasn't aware of that. And as I said, it was windy. So that sort of makes the whole atmosphere of the bush a little bit different. We do hear sometimes, we do have corvids, like we have ravens here. We have various birds that will alarm. Obviously, we hear them doing that sometimes, but not when you're sort of in a moment where you can associate it with something. We did have a willy wagtail, which is a really small, cute little black and white bird, alert us that there was a brown snake in the grass on our back fence line. Small birds will often alert about snakes because they can be prey.
Okay. And again, how did that make you guys feel? Were you extra heightened, or were you sort of relieved there was confirmation that the animal you were assuming was about and was responsible for some of the other signs you'd seen was then confirmed by a sighting? What did you make of that?
See, all of this whole journey with the big cats on this land is only still been about 18 months. So a lot has happened and it's been a lot to process. So I think I'd kind of come a bit more at peace about it between the first sighting and the second sighting. So even though it was kind of full on really to see the animal, this is only really like 200-300 metres from our house and we're on foot. But I'd already just accepted that they were in the landscape, and that both times when I've seen the animals, they've been running away. So that helps. So, yeah, it's exciting, but it's frustrating as well. I don't know if you've ever had the experience where you're flicking through a book and you see an illustration and you see exactly what it is, but then you're trying to flick back to find that page. And I feel like my sightings have been like that. It's like you've had that moment where you've seen what you've seen, but it's like, I just want to go back to that and have a better look,
Yeah, tantalising, a lot of it.
Yes, absolutely.
The other thing I remember, because I've been to Australia twice, and remember, you do get a lot of roadkill kangaroos, don't you? So, I mean, we do get a lot of roadkill deer in Britain, and they would do in America for pumas as well. And it strikes me that they would be scavenging. So I presume that there's plenty of roadkill available for them as well.
Yes, well, I think that some of these ones that I have been seeing have been on roadsides, and some of them have been more in the bush and on walking trails and away from roads. But I definitely think they are being opportunistic and eating some of the roadkill. So I actually started to wonder when we had about the 6 weeks of really intense, lots of carcasses, lots of meat being consumed, I actually started to wonder whether we had a female that had given birth and was staying very local, and that was why there was so much consumption. I don't know, but I wonder whether the animals have got wise up a bit to roads and the fact that the kangaroos are vulnerable at the road crossings, and then that they know they jump that fence and they go across the road there and then they jump that fence, and whether they're actually using the roads as ambush points as well sometimes. Because some of the injuries that I've seen are more consistent with an ambush kill, like an animal that's missing its head or scalped. Like the car doesn't do that. And if the animal's already dead because it's been hit by a car, then the big cat is perhaps going to come along and open it up and eat the organs or the muscle meat rather than do a injury that looks like a kill injury. I've had to get quite sort of forensic about looking at a site and also seeing sometimes there's prints, like not clear, nice clear prints, but indentations in gravel and in thick tan bark. I mean, some of them have just been very obvious. It's like it's been taken down from behind. Here's where it's run at it, like you can actually piece it together in your mind.
In terms of getting hard evidence from sign, like a hair that could yield a DNA result or scat or trail camera footage, what do you think is your best bet for that? I mean, you're not fully on the case of that because it's so time consuming, but you are trying to opportunistically do that in your studies, aren't you?
Yeah, I always look for things. I have picked up and photographed a couple of scats. The one that was the most interesting I didn't grab. It was quite fresh, and I think my husband was encouraging me to get going with the walk, but it was down near our wildlife reserve, and it was my little girl, Dingo, who I was walking, directed me to it. She sniffed it. It was definitely a carnivore scat. It was fresh, and there was a wide area, and I poked it with a stick, and it had a piece of bone fragment in it that was at least the size of my thumb. and I actually did the whole sniff thing, It got the metallic smell, but I didn't bag it up and take it with me. In hindsight, you think, well, that would have been good. I could have put it in water. I could have got that bone and whatever. It's very much heightened our experience of walking in the landscape, and I'm always sort of on the lookout for things. But I'm a pretty low-tech person, really. I've been relying really on my husband to be the sort of tech support with the camera, and we've only got the one. And so far, we haven't had any success.
It's all trial and error and learning, isn't it? I think the more you practice at all of these things, one day you'll be ready for a good potential bit of evidence that might yield something.
Yeah.
And of course, it may stop. I mean, that's the other thing. You don't know if this is going to be an ongoing issue or they just move away, they move away, they don't return.
That's right. Yeah. Also, I kind of feel a bit of conflict about getting definitive evidence. Like when we checked the camera, which I think it was 2 days ago, we could see on the camera that there was an animal there, but it was such a tiny little screen. It's like, it's tan and, it's got a long tail. It's got a black point on the tail. We took it home and went through it all and it was fox. But sort of in the intervening period, I'm like, well, what do I do? How would I respond? I would feel very conflicted. If I got the perfect evidence, I would feel very conflicted about what I did with that.
I think, but if you took your time to consider the most responsible and educational way to release it, if you wanted to, and never talk about the precise location, just say Victoria. Keep it vague, keep it responsible, keep it educational. But I think it also helps you also think about how a cat is using the landscape, isn't it? If you're trying to think the best place for trail cameras or where to look for scat.
Yes, that's right.
And are you okay about it? And there's two things. Are you okay about it as a local resident with animals on your land and neighbours and everything, as long as these cats are behaving themselves? There's that. And generally, in the Australian ecosystem, are you happy that melanistic leopards and mountain lions are around?
Short answer, yes. I mean, I feel like it's been a crazy ride and it's been a lot of feelings, and there's been times where it was really quite stressful and it wasn't particularly positive experience for me, and a lot of that was more not knowing who to talk to and where to go with it rather than the animal itself. But also just the proximity and the kind of safety, maybe not even so much for us, but for our animals. Like we now have goats, I hand-reared goats, and we lock our goats in at night because I've just seen too much to be able to, leave them out in a paddock overnight. In balance, it has been a positive. I mean, I have to be careful just going down to my goats in the morning to watch for kangaroo because there's a big kangaroo that can be nearby, and kangaroos can be dangerous. We have to be careful of snakes. Any wild animal really can be dangerous. I think it's actually good for us and good for our humanity to be humbled by nature and to not think that we're just, boss cocky all the time. Really, I think the cats are offering us a gift to rewild our spirits to some degree and kind of learn from this in deeper levels.
And if something is awkward, you don't have to necessarily eliminate it just because you can do, although the cats would be very difficult to eliminate, actually.
Yeah, that's right. That's coexistence and just being aware and mindful and careful, but also allowing it to enhance your experience of nature.
How do you feel about you being super aware now of these cats being around? A lot of the population would be not aware and sceptical. Does that bother you, or do you feel that's just how it is on the journey of discovery of super cryptic animals that are really stealthy?
Look, I think it's understandable. I think Australia as a nation, we can be quite cynical. I think often, we need to see something to believe it. I do understand people's cynicism. I do find rudeness difficult. This social media for this topic is, not the best forum.
Ultra scoffing and demeaning and spiteful. It's a bit over the top.
Yeah, that's right. I feel like it's hard to find sort of active, positive places and people where you can engage, if you know what I mean. I actually get a bit jealous of what I think goes on in the UK, where you seem to have more sort of groups of people that can get together and talk big cats and go sleuthing.
Yeah, particularly Scotland. Scotland has got a very, very now strong bonded group of investigators who all get on and support and respect each other. I think that's a very nice situation.
It's hard to kind of get a handle on what is Australian attitudes or what is UK attitudes, because as soon as you've had an experience, I guess your perception is skewed. You're now kind of on the inside of that experience. Most people haven't had that experience.
You can see many parallels to hearing landowners and local people talk on the podcast about their learning as they discover more and they see the signs and put the pieces together. You can see parallels, Andrea, can you, from what we hear on the British podcast?
I think so, yeah.
If you had a goat taken out and hollowed out, would that make you feel, what would be your reaction?
Well, we do take precautions, as I said, but if it was to happen like in daylight or something, or we forgot to lock them in, I mean, it would be devastating, but nature is nature. You can't kind of hate an animal for eating, really.
Now that you're more tuned in and listening out perhaps for what other people might be saying on local Facebook groups or gossip in the town or whatever, are you picking up other things which are reinforcing your suspicions and what you've seen?
I had previously, before my first sighting, read quite a few Facebook reports around the area. So I knew that historically and more recently there had been quite a few sightings around. There have been a few more people that I have talked to or just sort of heard on the grapevine. We'll see. I'm sure, if I'm meant to meet up with some other big cat buddies, I will. Or if anyone's listening in and perhaps would like to get in touch through you.
I know we have listeners all over Australia and Victoria, Melbourne especially. And a very good book, for children's book on the big cat, produced by a Victorian lady in Melbourne last year. Put that on the website before, but we'll put that again on the website for this episode. It's all part of the awareness raising to portray it in literature. Anything else you want to say before we close out, Andrea? It's all been terrific stuff. Lovely to hear deep thoughts you have. Any further reflections on the British or the Australian or your local situation?
The only other thing is, as many other people do, I would just like to thank you, Rick. You have been, just really key to supporting me on this journey, really. I've really appreciated the podcast, but also being able to send you, Carcass photos and emails, and you've been very prompt and very supportive, and it's, just really helped this gory, wild journey.
Yeah, well, thank you for that. For me, it's a learning experience as well, and to sort of compare your carcasses, especially with the deer carcasses and sheep carcasses in Britain, is fascinating and useful and interesting. I think some of yours are sort of pretty much dead certs and others are ambiguous. And you probably think that as well, actually. But you've got to check every one and go through the checklist, if you like.
Yes.
And it's just wonderful to have a good case study, good example ongoing in Australia. And to hear from that and hear the emotion and the sort of detective work you're doing, it makes it all real for me and for the podcast. So thank you for being part of this experience.
My pleasure, and I really appreciate the opportunity.
Great stuff. Well, just final point, actually. How does your husband feel about it? Is he same as you, or does he have different views?
Yeah, we have varied a little bit. I think it's like our stress responses have been different, if you know what I mean. Like I've probably wanted to talk about it more and he's probably not wanted to, so that's been a little bit tricky at times. But we're working our way. We've had to kind of find a way to manage it, between us. He's happy to be kind of tech support. We're sort of finding our way. It's hard. It's a big thing, and not everyone responds the same way.
Even in families, I mean, I've seen that. I've been round farm kitchen tables or in porter cabins at businesses, and there are different views round the table. But there's nearly always one or two people who are very highly protective and look at the people askance. If anybody's a bit more hostile, they'll try and, overrule them.
Yes.
Ultimately, I think people have a respect, regardless of whether you're more scared than the other person or more hostile or more on your guard. There seems to be a deep respect that, blimey, these predators are pretty wise and canny and experienced and know what they're doing around us.
Absolutely. Yeah. And he's definitely supportive, and he's on the journey too, whether he likes it or not.
Brilliant. Well, so good to hear from you. Lovely to be in Australia for an episode. And if anybody from Australia wants to come on with their journey and their examples, wonderful. Although we hope we get a missing panther back. It's such a classy podcast, but I know Ben puts a lot of effort in, and every episode must take a lot of crafting to produce, because it's very much documentary style, which would be much more time consuming in production. Meantime, we can host sort of case studies sometimes from Australia on this one, and if anybody wants to get in touch and be networked with you, I can put you guys in touch, so that's fine. Thank you very much again, and thanks for coming on Big Cat Conversations.
Thank you so much, Rick.
Well, for our final part of the show, back by popular demand, we have Mark Graves. Mark is now a fairly regular guest, and he was last with us for part of episode 112. As we've heard, he's got great experience with African and especially South African wildlife and leopards, because he was a former farmer there, a tracker there, and a specialist guide there. So Mark, welcome back again. How are you doing?
Thanks, Rick. Yeah, I'm doing very well, thank you. Good to be chatting to you again.
Good stuff. Last evening, Cheeky Owen, our producer, asked me what I was going to speak to you about. He said, I see you've got Mark Graves scheduled for tomorrow. And I told him what we had on our list. His response was, so basically it's a catch-up with your supervisor.
Yeah, Cheeky Owen, as you say.
Well, I think what I would say to that is we have to be our own supervisors of each other, because we've all got different strengths and skill sets and experiences. Nobody can know everything. And so we actually do act as critical friends if we're doing it right. And in fact, I think one of the first points we're going to hear from you is a critical friend advice to Craig and myself about the clawed carcass that we didn't get DNA on. What I'm going to say first, though, Mark, is that you haven't heard it because we're doing this before you've heard the recording, but listeners will have just heard a fascinating case in Australia where the vocalizations of the cats is chirping because they are pumas. Now, you've never heard puma chirping because you haven't had experience in the Americas, but you have heard another cat that does chirping like vocalizations, and that is a cheetah. So can you tell us a bit about cheetah vocalizations?
Sure. Cheetahs have evolved into their own genus would be the correct terminology. They make a very avian type chirp. If you don't know and you hear them in the bush, you definitely wouldn't think cat or any mammal at all. You would definitely be looking for a bird. So it'll be interesting. It'll be actually interesting to compare their chirp with that of the puma and see how similar they are.
Well, I'll put Owen, our producer, to some work and ask him to graft in some cheetah chirping. We're going to start the show with puma chirping, which people will have heard, so we can compare the cheetah chirping. That kind of vocalization, behavior-wise, it is basically communicating to another cheetah or seeing if anybody's there to respond to. Is that right?
Yeah, for sure. I've heard them very much when they're communicating with cubs. Not tiny cubs, but cubs that are following mum at a distance. That she will chirp fairly continually to let them know where to follow her. So they may not be in sight of her the whole time, but they'll hear her chirping and they'll follow those chirps. And I believe they'll chirp between adults as well. So with lions, it's a sort of mew.
Higher pitched call, isn't it?
Absolutely. It's almost like a cat mew, but it's a very short little kind of mew, mew that they just do to to communicate with the cubs.
Okay. Our discussion now is going to be just picking up on a few points that have cropped up on recent episodes, just to get your reflection and a discussion, because I think it's actually very healthy to review some of the things that come up on the podcast and get another take on them. And the first one we're going to talk about is back in episode 116, we heard from Craig, fellow resident in Herefordshire. You were shown the photographs when this happened. He found this really big fallow carcass, clearly dispatched and clawed round the throat and side of the face. No DNA from the swabs, only fox DNA. Now, clearly that's not fox type of traits on the carcass, but we know foxes can get to carcasses very early on to have a good sort of pick at them and scavenge of them. So I remember you saying at the time when we were showing you the photos and hoping you were suitably impressed, you said, well, guys, if you don't get DNA, don't go overboard with the sour grapes. So really, I want to tackle you on what you meant by that, Mark.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, Rick, I think scratches, claw marks, scrapes, you're getting into territory that is or can be very ambiguous. I mean, I only saw the photographs, so I had nothing else to go by. I didn't inspect the carcass at all. But just because you have some parallel scratches doesn't automatically mean that those are claw marks. It looked good to be a cat kill.
You could see the windpipe was severed.
Was severed and crushed. That is a much bigger indication. To me, it could well have been, but it's not definitive. Without being there and without looking at it, I couldn't weigh in any more heavily than that. But as with all these things, I always say the person dealing with it, the person on the ground who sees it and gives their judgment. Craig's got a bit of experience now. And, he's a very thorough investigator, very measured. So that, in a way, carries more weight for me than the photograph of the scratches, claw marks, whatever you want to call them. That was the only reason I just offered caution, before you launch fully into being definitive about it being claw.
What I'm happy to do, what I do is just show it to people and not thump the table saying, there you go, you must believe this is a cat. I just show it to people and say, by the way, Craig says, and I believe him, there's no barbed wire fences round there, and he didn't get his scalpel or razor blades out on it. So make your own conclusions. And it's quite influential, that carcass photo, with a combination of its situation, his video of where there seemed to be a disturbance, and then it went to the gate and was perhaps taken down at the gate. Several boxes ticked if you want to go there. But of course, I think you are being the critical friend, saying don't assume everybody's going to go there. And if there's reason to doubt, you do need something like DNA to be absolutely definitive. There we go. Lesson learned.
I think the critical friend is what they call peer review in the trade, isn't it? Basically getting like minds to pick it apart if they can. It's helpful criticism. So just because I feel one way or another doesn't mean that it's right. And the one thing I've learned investigating these kind of things over the years is that every situation is different, and almost invariably you will find something new, a new modus operandi or a new kind of sign, or every time you look at one of these scenes, you pick up something new, which is interesting. You can't put everything in a box.
Individual cats differ, and of course the experience of the cats differs. A very experienced adult cat will be a very efficient hunter and killer, whereas a new kid on the block, learning its trade, will often botch its early stage kills.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. Interesting enough, I'm just thinking about it. I haven't seen much in the way of clawing per se on smaller game, but when it comes to bigger animals, then you see it quite often. So, on the rumps or the withers of cow-sized animals, whether it be zebra, ponies, wildebeest, kudu, or anything big where they've got to really hold on to it, then you quite often see those raking marks. But usually on the smaller stuff, the impact of being grabbed and the neck being broken or the throat being crushed, they'll roll and stop pretty quickly, and you don't get this. The raking tends to come when the animal is trying to rip itself free of the grasp, and it's got to be a big animal to do that, usually. So when you show me photographs of sort of horses with raking down the side and things, then I'm immediately thinking, well, that's much more possible.
Yeah. In fairness, this was an extremely large female fallow. It's interesting, there wasn't any on the flanks. It was on the face and throat, which is interesting in itself.
Yeah, exactly. That would mean that it was sort of swatting the face, which, again, is an interesting reaction.
You've seen other carcasses recently from around the country that I've shown you. I think some of them look absolute dead cert, some of them a bit ambiguous, but they're all worth looking at because that's what people are finding and thinking, especially if they're pretty fresh, that are possibly cat-related. So you're seeing a fair range of what comes our way now, Mark.
Well, I think a lot of them you can see where either the muzzle grip or the throat grip or the back of the neck, which are very typical cat methods for dispatching animals. Those are all pretty clear. Quite a lot of carcasses have their ears eaten off, which I've seen very often in Africa with leopard kills particularly. Yeah, and the way they're plucked and the entrails are taken out and left to one side and the sort of peeling back of the skin and taking out of the nutritious organs and going for the quality meat. Those are all very cat-like behaviors. So there's a lot that shows us that there is cat predation going on.
The one that's intriguing is this ear tears. Sometimes both are off, sometimes one is off. I would say from the ones that I think tick the boxes, and I'm pretty sure are cat-related, I would say 70-80% of them have one or more ears off. Could that be from dragging? Could it be from initial purchase to get with a grapple and the ear something to hold on to as well? Or is there an early consumption of an ear because they want the cartilage or something from it? What are your views on that?
I'm not sure. I've definitely witnessed it very, very often. A kill, one of the first things that'll go will be the ears. So I don't think it's during the struggle, and I don't think it being torn off when they're dragging it. I mean, if you were to pick up a dead impala, for example, by an ear and drag it, the ear does not come off. That cartilage is incredibly tough.
Yeah, they tend to hold them around the neck often, don't they, when they're dragging them?
Absolutely. They take them by the neck and then they allow the body to drag between their legs. So they'll sort of walk bow-legged or wide-legged and let the carcass sort of be dragged underneath their bellies. But the ears are eaten off. I mean, not every time, but very, very often. And if you disturb or you find a carcass that has been disturbed, so only partly eaten, often the ears will be gone with a little bit of meat. But I think there must be something in that cartilage that they're looking for, maybe calcium. I'm not sure.
Yeah, interesting. Mark, have you seen a carcass like an impala or something, it's a roe deer size type prey item, being dragged to the side? Now, we had a young farm worker keeps in touch. He's very sure he's got a cat. First time he saw it, he looking out of his cab, he couldn't understand how this roe deer was moving on its side across this field. Then he suddenly saw a black head beyond it and a huge long black tail behind it, and he thought, that is a black panther with a roe deer on its side that is dragging across the field. Fantastic description. He was really impressed and he's very intrigued because he's had 2 more sightings and he's looking for sign and just bought a couple of trail cameras. So he's potentially going to be a good contact and hopefully a podcast guest. But interesting that it was dragging it to the side of its body, that one.
They do. I've seen that. They drag it to the side and they also drag backwards occasionally as well. So they'll reverse and drag it, want to get it under a bush or something like that. They can drag them a long way. And yes, they do drag them to the side, especially if it's a slightly smaller prey animal. I think if it's very big, the weight naturally goes under their bellies. But if it's a bit smaller, they can definitely drag it to one side.
Good stuff. Thank you. Okay, well, we'll get on to a couple of points from the actual last episode 121, where Liz was talking about the mother and cub incidents. And there's 2 points. We'll get on to the nature's alarm calls, the corvids and magpies and bird alarms and nature's alarms in a minute. But first of all, we wanted to talk about when a cat looks bigger because the fur's puffed out or might have grown in the winter because of the winter coat issue. And I'm very grateful to Liz for bringing up the winter coat issue because it comes up with some witness descriptions. The fur seems thick and more strandy than they expected, and they conclude maybe it's a winter coat. But there is another explanation, and it's a cat with goosebumps in the cold weather. So could you talk us through this?
So all animals have the ability for their hair to stand up. I mean, we do when we're in a situation where we feel threatened or vulnerable or whatever, our hairs will stand up, and that is a natural reaction. So if you think of animals, they use that to be able to create size. So if you think of a cat that's being threatened, it will put all its hair up and make itself look twice the size. Dogs put their hackles up. Even birds, if you think of chickens, two cockerels fighting, they'll put their hackles up to make themselves look bigger and more aggressive or more dominant. So it is a very natural thing to be able to do. The other time where hair will stand on edge is if it's cold. So we've been talking about these cold early mornings where these cats are looking, quite often they say they look less sleek. They look a bit dull and the coats look slightly straggledy. Its correct term is piloerection, which means literally standing up of the hair. And the reason they do it in the cold is simple. It's like your duvet. If you fluff up the down in your duvet, it traps warmth and it keeps you warmer. So if the hair is standing on end, there's more space in there to hold warm air heated by the body. So it keeps them warmer. So on these cold mornings, you will see most animals will piloerect in order to keep themselves a couple of degrees warmer than they would do otherwise. Conversely, when it's hot, you'll see the fur goes absolutely sleek and flat.
In fairness, Liz did say it was a very frosty morning. She saw the black on the white background. I guess that contrast would have shown any puffing up of the hair, the fur, more deliberately anyway, because black on white with that contrast. But that may well have been what it was, especially when she'd seen the hair as normal, the very sleek, short-cropped hair 6 weeks earlier when she'd had the previous sighting. So I did actually mention this to her, and she feels that it might well have been piloerection. I think some people call it piloerection, don't they? Whichever, anyway. And she realises it could have been that now. She's thinking about it. But it was still a good discussion point, because you can have both, of course, because if I look at Zaki, my little black cat that I have here, he has at the moment, on cold winter mornings, he definitely puffs his hair up, which would be piloerection. But he's also got a winter coat, no doubt about it, because at the moment his collar is sinking, his bell collar sinks much firmer into the hair, so you can hardly see it, whereas in the summer months it's very prominent. So yeah, he's got that thicker fur in the winter, and he's got piloerection puffed up on cold mornings.
Sure. And I mean, in countries where you get very definite winters, then growing a winter coat is entirely normal. I mean, you think about your dog or your cat. In the springtime, it molts and sheds all over the house, and a new summer coat that's shorter and cooler will come in, and then come the autumn, the opposite happens. So, yeah.
In fact, I was talking to my daughter about this, who's a vet. She was mentioning the point that it's a debating point about whether, if you've got a dog or a horse, in the wintertime, you should put a coat on them. You can buy coats for them, rug-type, Velcro-up coats. And she said, of course, if you do that, are you suppressing the body's natural tendency to have piloerection to help warm up?
Yeah, I think with the horses, they do it mainly when they clip them. So if they clip off the winter coats to make them look smart for whatever they're doing, then they need to replace that with a rug. I think horses that are sort of put out to pasture during the winter tend to just be left with their shaggy winter coats. It's also the same with dogs. If you've got a sleek greyhound or whippet, it's going to need a little bit of extra help, whereas your St. Bernard or your golden retriever is probably going to be okay with that.
Yeah. Well, we're being greedy with this episode because we've got 2 words of the week. We've had upside down country from our Australian guest, Andrea, and we've got piloerection for this part of the episode. Thank you for explaining that, Mark. The other point that we had from Liz that I know you were very interested in is something we don't get as often as you might expect from British guests, actually, and that is, bird alarm calls. Liz mentioned that the corvids, the magpies and crows were kicking off and alarming and disturbing the cats and doing that by hassling them. And, of course, that is common in South Africa. You've seen it from many different types of wildlife. Obviously, it's something to look out for here. So tell us about your experience with nature's alarm calls in South Africa.
Sure, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, alarm calls are critical, especially when you're a walking guide. If you're out in the bush, we use alarm calls all the time to alert us to potential animal up in front of us, or if we want to find something, if we've got the opportunity to go and find something, the alarm calls are invaluable. Just about all birds will alarm. So corvids are very, very obvious because they're very raucous and they will mob heavily. But if you look at that sort of bird party that will be mocking and mobbing the predator, you'll find that there are many other smaller birds in and amongst them as well, songbirds as well. Once you're aware and you tune into it, you can definitely notice the alarm calls and use them to go and find the predator. In Africa, of course, we've got other animals that, impala will alarm by snorting, the bushbuck and all the triglyphines, the spiral horn antelope tend to bark to give an alarm call. You've got monkeys and baboons that will give alarm calls. So most things will have some sort of an alarm call. And if you hear a raucous alarm call in the distance and you approach it carefully using the wind, using cover, using the sun to cover you, there's a very, very good chance that you'll get a sighting of a predator. As soon as Liz mentioned the corvids going crazy, to me that was an absolute sure sign to validate and verify her story to me.
By contrast, Liz also said that sometimes things go really, really quiet. No bird song whatsoever. Now, we've heard other guests and I've heard other witnesses say that, and they've assumed for different tactical reasons nature keeps stum. Is that credible? Is that how you see it in South Africa sometimes as well?
Yes. I feel that if a predator is in the stalk or it's actively looking to make a kill, then things tend to go very quiet. If it is just patrolling or going about its business, then quite often it'll attract alarming. But it's not always the case. But yes, there are definitely moments where things go quiet.
So that is birds and mammals keeping their heads down, basically, because they've realised that the vibes have changed. Business is business. The predator means something.
I mean, alarm calls are more common. I mean, if you've got a major predator, you're going to find things alarming. But I have definitely watched lion and leopard in the hunt. And as it's getting closer to actually making the chase, I've noticed on a number of occasions that things go dead quiet. So it can very much trigger a silent. And it's interesting because it's not just the birds and the animals. It's almost like the insects and everything goes. It's like there's an unnatural silence suddenly. Maybe it's an energy or who knows, but it's a weird, unnatural silence that suddenly will descend.
Okay, nature's powers that we don't fully understand yet.
Sure.
Well, thank you for those very good reflections on past snippets from episodes.
I mean, interesting enough, a number of my friends and contacts in Africa who are highly experienced, more experienced than I am in this area, I will put a couple of bits and pieces across to them for their input. And they still, even though they're seeing some of the things that we have availability, and they're saying, yep, that's unequivocally a leopard, but they still doubt that it's possible that they're here. They're just saying, well, they can't get their heads around it, that there can be leopards in Europe, in the UK. So,
yet they know how stealthy and cryptic leopards are.
Yeah, and we talk about it, we chat about it a lot, and they're like, well, yeah, you know what you're looking at, and yes, we're looking at this and we concur with you, but it can't be possible. It must just be an animal that's escaped or something. So people really struggle with it as a concept, really struggle with it.
Well, I ought to say, actually, last week I had a gentleman from France, that he would be the third now British guy who is a witness, explain perfectly, viewing for about 30 seconds from his balcony in southern France in a sort of foresty scrub area. He's got a big wild garden that merges with the neighbouring scrub and forest. And he said he went back and looked up this animal. He said it's unmistakably a black leopard. And I said, usual questions, was it fit, healthy, properly wild? And he said all of those. He couldn't believe it. Looked perfectly at home. He had no idea about big cat reports in France, and he was very pleased to look on the web and find the podcast and see that we've done a couple of French episodes. He was just leaving the property. His mobile phone was in the back of the room, and he just wanted to keep watching the animal rather than miss it by running to get the phone camera. But he said he will scale the area, the view, re-look at the view and put a marker where the animal was, but he's absolutely sure. Classic description, sleek black animal, and assumed it was a black leopard when he went and looked up black panthers on the internet. So they can get, more than just in Britain. And it begs the question about how many are in France. Is it just the odd one or two vagrant ones, or are they breeding a bit in France as well?
Well, that's now the last French person you had on, or English person living in France, was up near it's up in the north of France, wasn't it? It was north of Paris.
That was the first one. We subsequently had another person in the more sort of middle ground, Lakeland area of Midwest France, I think. So they've been spread out, actually.
Covers the whole, north to south. And Europe being Europe and not having too many boundaries or physical boundaries between countries, there's no stopping where they could be. And they've got a much bigger territory to expand into. So if the same thing is happening there, who knows, then they've got much more space to expand into than in the United Kingdom, where eventually we will get to presumably a number where we start to get quite close territories because they're going to be pushing up against their neighbours. But it will take a while, obviously.
That's assuming that the population stays healthy and disperses in a natural way. Maybe other factors intervene.
Yeah.
We don't know.
Bottleneck is going to be the biggest problem, the genetic bottleneck, depending on what we started with. And these are questions that we would love to know the answers to, and we'll see. Maybe one day.
Okay. Well, thanks for this, Mark. Anything else you wanted to reflect on or point out?
I'm in the process of getting my family together and heading back out to Africa. I've been out of the bush for nearly 5 years now, so I'm very happy to be going back where I can go back into doing some guiding or doing some training and maybe some research. I'm not sure yet exactly which field I go into, but definitely to get back into the bush and to re-familiarise myself with all the things that I know and love. I will stay an active member of Big Cat Conversations and hopefully we'll be able to keep contributing to what's going on here. And I will be coming back and forth a lot as well. So.
Well, we wish you well with that, Mark. Kenya really is going to be your base, isn't it?
Yes, that's right. I spent 14 years in Uganda and then 12 years in South Africa. But having spent the last 3 or 4 years here, now we'll head to Kenya and hopefully use my skills to be able to teach and train people again, which would be fantastic.
And of course, from there, because you'll be close to Nairobi, you can get access to other parts of Africa, in fact, other parts of the world, if you're going to be involved in guiding and fieldwork projects, which of course you could be. And if anybody's listening and wants to partner you and employ you as a guide, you might be doing that kind of work in the future. You could access different parts of the globe from Nairobi.
Yeah, it's a global hub. Nairobi's a busy hub. It's great for the rest of Africa. It's also great for international travel. So, yep, absolutely. And it's certainly one of the best African travel destinations if you want to come and see wildlife. So Kenya down into the northern Tanzania area is just extraordinary. So, yeah, if anybody wants to come and see, then they're very welcome.
Okay, well, I can put people in touch with you if anybody is thinking about that in the future. We wish you well with that, Mark. We will miss you here, but of course, we'll nag you on the phone from time to time and hear from you for more and get your perspective again. Meantime, Mark, thanks ever so much for coming back on the show. Thanks for coming on Big Cat Conversations.
Great, Rick. Keep up the good work.